The wheelchair stopped at the edge of the enclosure, and the silverback turned his head with a slowness that made every breath in the sanctuary hold still. 300 pounds of raw muscle, hands the size of dinner plates, eyes black as riverstones locked onto the little girl, sitting motionless in her chair. She didn't blink. She didn't move. And the gorilla, Kazi, who had attacked 2 handlers in the past year and had been deemed too dangerous for public viewing, dropped the branch he was holding and walked toward the glass with a gentleness no one in that room had ever seen before. Dr. Elena Marsh stood frozen behind the observation window, her hands pressed against the cool surface, her swollen belly tight against the edge of the desk. And she felt something impossible unfolding in front of her, something that would unravel everything she thought she understood about trauma, memory, and the strange architecture of survival. The girl's name was Amara, 7 years old. She had been found 3 weeks earlier in the wreckage of an overturned van on Route 9, barely conscious, her legs shattered below the knee, her spine compressed in 2 places. The paramedics said it was a miracle she survived. The doctors said she would never walk again, but none of them could explain why she hadn't spoken a single word since the accident, why her eyes carried the weight of something far older than 7 years, or why she had started drawing the same image over and over again in her hospital room. A large black shape with silver on its back, hands open, eyes watching. When the social worker brought her to the primate sanctuary as part of a therapeutic visit, no one expected anything to happen. Elena had agreed to the visit reluctantly, still reeling from her own nightmare 3 months prior when she had been held at gunpoint in the Congo during a research expedition, when the rebels had found her team's camp and everything had collapsed into screaming and fire, and the moment she realized she was pregnant and might die before ever meeting her child. She came back to the States broken in ways no one could see, and the only thing that kept her breathing was the work, the gorillas, the language of trauma she could read in their eyes because it mirrored her own. Kazi was pacing now, his massive frame moving along the glass partition with a focus that made Elena's heart hammer against her ribs. This was the gorilla who had been rescued from a roadside zoo in Nevada, who had lived in a concrete cell for 9 years, who had been beaten with metal rods and starved and taught that humans were nothing but pain. When he arrived at the sanctuary 18 months ago, he wouldn't eat for 5 days. He wouldn't let anyone near him. He charged the barriers whenever someone approached, his screams echoing through the facility like the sound of something being torn apart from the inside. Dr. Reeves, the head veterinarian, wanted him sedated permanently. The board wanted him transferred to a maximum security facility. But Elena had looked into his eyes and seen herself, seen the girl she had been at 19 when her father died, and she had stood in the rain at his funeral, unable to cry, unable to feel anything except the terrible weight of being left behind. She fought for Kazi. She spent hours sitting outside his enclosure, not moving, not speaking, just being present in the way trauma survivors need someone to be present, a witness to the fact that they are still alive, still here, still worth the air they breathe. Amara lifted her hand slowly, fingers splayed against the glass, and Kazi stopped. The entire room seemed to stop. Elena could hear the hum of the ventilation system, the distant call of macaques in the adjacent building, the sound of her own blood rushing in her ears. The gorilla raised his hand and placed it against the glass where Amara's small palm rested, matching her gesture with a precision that defied everything science said about coincidence and instinct. His eyes softened, his jaw relaxed. And then he did something that made Elena's knees weaken. He pressed his forehead against the glass and closed his eyes, his massive chest rising and falling in a rhythm that looked exactly like grief. Amara's face crumpled. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out, just a silent gasp of air, and tears began streaming down her cheeks in rivers that soaked the collar of her sweater. The social worker rushed forward, but Elena grabbed her arm, shook her head, whispered, "Wait, just wait," because something was happening here that was bigger than protocol, bigger than procedure, something ancient and cellular and true. The girl began to rock in her wheelchair, forward and back, her hand still pressed to the glass, and Casey moved with her, swaying in the same rhythm, his eyes still closed, his breath fogging the barrier between them. Elena felt her own tears coming and couldn't stop them, didn't want to stop them, because she understood in that moment what she was witnessing: recognition, not between species but between survivors, between two souls who had been shattered by violence and were now finding each other in the wreckage. She thought of the night in the Congo, when she had hidden under a pile of equipment while the soldiers searched the camp, when she had felt the baby move inside her for the first time and realized she had to survive not just for herself, but for this fragile pulse of life that depended on her. This tiny heartbeat that needed her to be brave, even when every part of her wanted to disappear. She had crawled through the jungle for 11 hours before reaching the extraction point, her hands bloody, her body screaming, but she had made it, she had survived. And now she was watching another survivor reach across the impossible distance between human and animal and say, without words, "I see you. I know what they did to you. I know what it costs to keep breathing." The sanctuary's alarm split the air like a knife. Red lights began spinning in the corners of the room. Elena's radio crackled. Code black. Code black. Kazi's enclosure. Interior door malfunction. I repeat, interior door malfunction. She looked at the security panel, and her blood turned to ice. The hydraulic lock on the inner chamber was failing. The door that separated Kazi from the observation room was sliding open. She had maybe 20 seconds before a 400-pound silverback gorilla who had trauma-bonded with a little girl, but who was still wild, still unpredictable, still capable of killing a human being in 3 seconds flat, would be standing in the same room with them. The social worker screamed. 2 staff members burst through the main door shouting for everyone to evacuate, but Eleanor looked at Amara, saw the girl's eyes widen, not with fear, but with something that looked disturbingly like hope, and she made a decision that would either save everything or destroy everything. She stepped in front of the wheelchair. She placed her body between the opening door and the child, and she said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat, "Nobody move. Do not run. Do not scream. Stay absolutely still." Kazi emerged from the darkness of the inner chamber like a shadow gaining weight. His shoulders were broader than Elena remembered. His hands looked like they could crush stone. He stood at full height, his head nearly touching the ceiling, and his eyes swept the room with an intelligence that made her understand why early humans must have worshipped creatures like this, why the old stories spoke of animals as gods and guardians and judges of human worth. Her baby kicked hard against her ribs. She felt wetness on her face and realized she was crying again, not from fear, but from the sheer overwhelming weight of standing at the intersection of life and death and motherhood and wildness and having no idea which direction the universe would choose. Kazi's gaze settled on her, then dropped to her swollen belly. His nostrils flared. He took one step forward, and Elena felt her heart stop because she knew, she absolutely knew, that if he charged, there was nowhere to go, no way to protect Amara, no way to protect her own child. And this would be how her story ended, crushed under the weight of a decision made from compassion instead of logic. But Kazi didn't charge. He lowered himself to all fours and moved past Elena, with a deliberateness that seemed almost ceremonial, his eyes fixed on the little girl in the wheelchair. Amara's hands were shaking, her whole body was shaking, and then her lips moved, and a sound came out, broken and small but real, the first word she had spoken in 3 weeks. "Friend." The syllable hung in the air like a prayer. Kazi stopped directly in front of her, so close Eleanor could smell the musk of his fur, could see the scars on his knuckles from years of beating concrete walls. He reached out one massive hand, moving with a gentleness that seemed impossible for something so large, and touched Amara's knee. The dead knee. The knee that had no feeling. And the girl gasped, because somehow impossibly she felt it. "I feel it," she whispered. "I can feel his hand." Elena's radio was exploding with voices demanding updates, demanding she clear the room, demanding sedation protocols, but she couldn't move. She was watching something that neuroscience couldn't explain, something that lived in the territory between miracle and delusion, and the wild unmapped places where trauma rewrites the rules of what's possible. Kazi's hand moved from Amara's knee to her hand, and their fingers intertwined, black fur and brown skin, strength and fragility, predator and prey, transformed into something that had no name in human language. The gorilla made a sound low in his chest, not a growl, but something softer, something that sounded like the noise a mother makes when comforting a frightened child, and Amara leaned forward in her wheelchair and pressed her face against Kazi's shoulder and sobbed, great heaving sobs that seemed to contain every nightmare from the accident, every moment of waking up unable to move, every hour of silence that had built up inside her like a dam finally breaking. Dr. Reeves burst into the room with a tranquilizer rifle, and Elena turned to face him, her body still positioned between the gun and the gorilla, and said with a ferocity that surprised even herself, "If you fire that weapon, I will make sure you never work with animals again." The room went silent. Reeves stared at her like she had lost her mind. Maybe she had. Maybe standing between a traumatized gorilla and a traumatized child while 8 months pregnant was the definition of insanity. But Elena had learned something in that jungle in the Congo, crawling through the dark with her hands torn and bleeding. Sometimes the only sane response to an insane world is to trust the inexplicable, to believe that survival creates its own language, its own recognition, its own mercy. "He's not going to hurt her," Elena said. "He's not going to hurt anyone. Look at him." And Reeves did look, and his hands slowly lowered the rifle, because even he could see what was happening, could see that Kazi was cradling Amara's hand like it was made of glass, could see that the most dangerous animal in the facility was being impossibly, inexplicably gentle. The story came out in pieces over the following weeks. Amara's mother had worked at a wildlife rehabilitation center in Montana before the family moved east. She had raised an orphaned gorilla infant for 6 months before it was transferred to a permanent facility. The gorilla's name had been Kazi. The social workers found photographs in the mother's belongings. A younger woman holding a baby gorilla, bottle feeding it, the infant's hand wrapped around her finger. Amara had been 2 years old. She had spent hours watching her mother care for that gorilla, had toddled around the rehabilitation center while Kazi learned to climb and play and trust. Then the transfer happened and Kazi disappeared into the system, moving from facility to facility until he ended up in that concrete hell in Nevada. And Amara's mother, 3 years later, died of an aneurysm while driving, which caused the crash that destroyed Amara's legs and nearly destroyed Amara herself. The girl had no memory of Kazi, at least not consciously, but her hands remembered, her heart remembered, and somehow, impossibly, Kazi remembered too. Eleanor stood in the observation room at dawn, 3 weeks after the incident, watching Amara work with the physical therapist inside Kazi's enclosure under carefully controlled conditions. The girl was standing now, leaning on parallel bars, her legs shaking with effort, and Kazi sat 10 feet away, watching her with an intensity that made Elena's throat tight. Every time Amara stumbled, the gorilla would tense, would start to rise, and Elena would see the same protective instinct she felt in her own body every time her baby kicked, the same fierce, irrational need to keep something small and fragile safe from a world that breaks things. Amara took one step, then another. Kazi made a sound of encouragement, a soft hoot that echoed through the space. The girl looked at him and smiled, really smiled, and took a third step. Elena pressed her hand against her belly and felt her daughter, moving inside her, felt the strange circular nature of healing, how trauma passes through generations, but so does resilience. How sometimes the only way to save yourself is to witness someone else refusing to stay broken. The board of directors wanted to separate them. Too dangerous, they said, too unpredictable. But Elena had spent 3 months documenting every interaction, measuring cortisol levels, heart rate variability, behavioral markers of stress and calm. The data was undeniable. Kazi was healing. His aggressive episodes had stopped completely. He was eating normally, sleeping through the night, engaging with enrichment activities he had ignored for over a year. And Amara was speaking in full sentences now, laughing, showing interest in the world again, regaining motor control in her legs that 3 neurologists had said was medically impossible. The bond between them was doing what years of therapy and medication had failed to do. It was giving them both a reason to keep trying, keep fighting, keep believing that the future could be different from the past. Elena wrote a proposal for a new therapeutic program, one that would bring other trauma survivors to work with Kazi and the other rescued primates. One that would honor the strange truth that sometimes healing doesn't come from science or medicine, but from the simple act of being seen by another creature who understands what it means to survive the unsurvivable. She went into labor on a Tuesday morning while sitting in Kazi's observation room, writing notes on his interaction with a new group of children from a domestic violence shelter. The contractions hit like a fist, and she gasped, doubling over, and Kazi immediately charged the glass, not in aggression, but in alarm, his eyes wide, his hands pressed against the barrier. Eleanor looked at him through the pain and laughed, actually laughed, because of course this was how it would happen. Of course she would go into labor in front of a gorilla who had learned to care about fragile things. The staff rushed her to the hospital. 14 hours later, she held her daughter for the first time, a tiny, wrinkled human with black hair and furious lungs. And Elena cried not from pain, but from the overwhelming relief of having brought something beautiful into the world, despite everything that had tried to break her, despite the guns and the jungle, and the nights she had been sure she wouldn't make it. She named her daughter Amara. A different Amara, but carrying the same spirit, a survivor, a fighter, a soul too stubborn to let the darkness win. 6 months later, Eleanor brought her baby to the sanctuary for the first time. She stood at the observation window with Amara in her arms, the original Amara now walking with leg braces, and a determination that made everyone who met her believe in miracles. And Kazi approached the glass with that same gentle curiosity he had shown the first time. He looked at the infant, looked at Elena, and then he placed his hand against the glass and waited. Elena lifted baby Amara's tiny hand and pressed it against the barrier where Kazi's palm rested, and the gorilla closed his eyes and made that sound again, that low rumbling sound that contained grief and recognition and something that felt like blessing. "Thank you," Elena whispered, knowing he couldn't understand the words, but hoping he could understand the weight behind them, the gratitude for teaching her that survival isn't just about making it through the nightmare, but about finding the courage to stay open, stay tender, stay capable of connection, even when every instinct screams to build walls and never let anyone close again. The original Amara stood beside them now, one hand on her walker, one hand reaching up to touch Elena's shoulder. "He remembers my mom," she said quietly. "I think that's why he knew me. I think he was waiting for us to find each other again." Elena nodded, unable to speak because the truth of it was too large, too strange, too perfect in its terrible beauty. The world had taken so much from all of them: Kazi's freedom, Amara's mother and her ability to walk, Elena's sense of safety, and the 9 months of pregnancy she should have spent in joy instead of terror. But somehow in the rubble of all that loss, they had found each other. They had built something new from the broken pieces. And that, Elena thought, watching the gorilla and the girl and her infant daughter all connected by this invisible thread of survival and recognition and hope, that was the only miracle that mattered, not the kind that erases pain or rewinds time, but the kind that says, you are not alone, you are seen, and you are loved not despite the scars, but because of them. Because they prove you fought and you're still here, and you refuse to let the cruelty of the world convince you that gentleness is weakness. If you believe that healing can come from unexpected places, that compassion has no boundaries between species, and that even the most broken among us can find our way back to wholeness through connection and courage, then this story is for you. Subscribe to hear more stories about the resilience of the human spirit and the animals who remind us what it means to be truly alive. Because in a world that often feels too hard, too cruel, too overwhelming, these are the stories we need. Stories that prove love is stronger than trauma, that hope can grow in the darkest soil, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is open our hearts when everything tells us to shut down. Thank you for listening, thank you for believing, and thank you for being here.